If you're like me, you're starting to feel like you're living in a reality show you never signed up for. Every day, it's another headline, another outrage, and somehow, you're the problem if you dare to ask questions. Why does common sense feel like it's so out of style? Why are we told to trust the system one minute, but to burn it all down the next? And why is it that in moments of chaos, the left always manages to twist tragedy into a moral weapon aimed straight at people like you and me? It seems like every day, the left finds a new way to turn contradictions into art. Performance art, that is. Today we've got jurors dismissed for unconventional hair, shooters waxing poetic about injustice, and, of course, the talking heads playing racial hopscotch on live TV. It's like the left bought a one-way ticket to absurdity and said, next stop, gaslight station. But don't worry, we're pulling back the curtain and asking the real questions they're too busy shouting over. Like, why is the left's favorite juggling act exploiting tragedies while conveniently ignoring the inconvenient details? Why is it that a man loses his life on a subway and suddenly Marines are branded trained assassins? Why is compassion conditional on the right demographics? And why is a jury's decision somehow a symptom of America's supposed inherent bias? Forget logic. This is emotional gymnastics at its finest. So let's break this down together, one contradiction at a time, starting with the latest from the United Health assassin, Luigi Mangione, who said this on his way into his extradition hearing in Pennsylvania yesterday.
Luigi, do it. It's completely out of touch, and it's an insult to the intelligence of the American people and the lived experience.
Now, for anyone who missed it, Luigi said this is an insult to the intelligence of the American people. Big words for a guy being dragged into court for ambushing and killing the CEO of United Healthcare. But let's break this down because on its face, this is more than just a courtroom outburst. It's a glimpse into the mind of someone who thinks he's smarter, more righteous, and frankly better than the rest of us. Mangione isn't speaking for the people. He's speaking for himself, his own ego, his own rage, and his own misguided delusions that his actions were somehow justified or noble. Newsflash, they weren't. This is a classic case of someone cloaking personal violence in big, dramatic language, hoping it'll sound profound enough to distract us from the fact that he murdered an unarmed man. An insult to the intelligence of the American people? No, Luigi. What's insulting is pretending your personal vendetta against corporate greed makes you a revolutionary instead of a criminal. What's insulting is cheapening the frustrations we all have with healthcare by tying them to a senseless killing. And yet, parts of the media can't resist treating Mangione's outburst like a moment of truth, a soundbite worth dissecting or sympathizing with. Here's the thing. Frustration with our systems doesn't mean we get to commit murder, and a few buzzwords like parasites don't make you a hero. Mangione's not a martyr, and he's certainly not a voice for the people. He's just one man who thought his anger gave him the right to play judge, jury, and executioner. And that's the real insult. And speaking of twisting reality to fit your narrative, next we have BLM leader Chivona Newsome, who claims black female jurors were shut out of the Daniel Penny trial because, well, I think you can guess.
A diverse Manhattan jury. Why is it? Well, it was 4 people of color. That's known typically as
I was there during jury selection.
Whether it was
black women were shut out for having unconventional hair, but there were 9 white jurors.
Sorry, is that what they said? They said it was for unconventional hair? Or you're just presuming that?
It was unconventional hair.
A juror was dismissed for having unconventional hair. That's made up.
No, it's not.
Who said? Which lawyer said that?
The defense attorney.
Which one? He said what?
He said that she had unconventional hair because her hair was purple, that she would have unconventional thoughts. And that, were you in the court?
No, I was not.
For 7 weeks?
I was not. But I understand. But the idea, right? Well, but again, the notion that she's being dismissed because of her hair. I assume you're assuming it's because of her race, right?
It absolutely was about weight.
Right.
Why was the expert jury consultant brought in who got off people for OJ, who had a racial trial, who brought in Kyle Rittenhouse, a young man who bought an AR-15 and killed Americans exercising their
What does Kyle Rittenhouse have to do with this?
Because the jury expert who clearly got off Daniel Penny today, it's
the jury expert, it's not the jurors, right?
The jury expert.
Not the jurors who heard the case, right?
This woman specialized for 35 years in the psychology of juries.
Right.
She specialized in race.
You know how many of those specialists lose their cases?
Well, not this.
A lot of them.
That's why Daniel Penny took the great money of people who hate black people to pay.
Now, let's be clear. When someone says unconventional hair, they don't mean a hairstyle that challenges physics. They mean purple dyed hair. purple. And yet somehow this mundane detail gets spun into a national injustice. Now, I hate to break it to Newsome, but hair color isn't a protected class. Claiming purple hair equals racial bias is a kind of rhetorical leap that would get laughed out of any serious debate. And yet here we are forced to entertain it. But here's where her argument really unravels. Newsome presents zero evidence beyond her own assumptions. Who said hair color was the reason a juror was dismissed? Which lawyer made this claim? She never answers because she doesn't have an answer. Instead, she pivots to vague accusations about jury consultants and racial conspiracies, another logical fallacy, by the way. Yes, the defense used the jury consultant. That's not scandalous. It's standard trial practice. Consultants analyze juror behavior to maximize their client's chances. Newsome implying this is inherently racist, that's not an argument, that's a distraction. And when Dan Abrams calls her out on it, pressing her with the facts that the jury included 4 people of color, what does she do? She doubles down. Yes, the jury is racist, she says, as if repeating it enough times will make it true. Never mind the diversity, never mind the evidence. For Newsome, the verdict itself is proof of bias. That's circular logic at its finest. If the jury didn't convict Penny, it must be racist. There's no room for facts, context, or even the concept of reasonable doubt. This is the danger of Newsome's rhetoric. By reducing complex legal outcomes to empty accusations of racism, she cheapens actual instances of injustice. She disrespects the jury's role, ignores the evidence they considered, and undermines faith in the judicial process, all for the sake of her narrative. What's worse, she insults the very people she claims to defend by suggesting their value as jurors depends not on their judgment but on their hair color. That's not fighting for justice. That's feeding a narrative at any cost.
So it had to have been race, right? It's not possible. So here's my theory on this, and it's actually a reverse race thing, which I think you're going to really disagree with, right? Well, I'll tell you what. I don't think this case would have been charged if it had been a white victim and a white person who had held him in a chokehold. I don't even think there'd be charges in this case.
Think it actually would. And I actually think that you would be calling Daniel Penny a murderer. Have you heard of Nathaniel Terry? A 27-year-old black man. He was an absolute monster in 2021. He killed an unidentified to this day homeless man in the project staircase. Mm-hmm. Did you see BLM come out for that type of monster? Grant our credibility. Well, when do we come out for cases that are not racially charged, would normally be ignored?
Why is this a race case? Did Daniel Penny say anything racist when it happened?
What is the labeling and the stereotypes? Daniel Penny, when he lied during interrogations, which no one is showing.
But answer my question. When was the race? When did he bring race into this?
Him a crackhead. And he said he was doing crackhead things. The problem is Daniel Penny showed no remorse for nothing he did. And that dishonors the real service people of this country, the real Marines who don't lie, who care for others, and who do no harm.
Chivona Newsome's argument is shaky at best. First, she tries to use Nathaniel Terry, a completely unrelated case, as some kind of proof of hypocrisy, asking, where was BLM then? That's an irrelevant and frankly embarrassing deflection. Comparing a brutal intentional murder to what happened in the Daniel Penny case is like comparing arson to an accidental fire. Terry killed a man deliberately. Penny, by contrast, restrained Jordan Neely in what he and others believed was a dangerous situation spiraling out of control, an act of intervention gone tragically wrong. The legal question here is whether Penny's actions were criminal. Not whether he is a saint, not whether he had perfect judgment in the moment, but whether his use of force crossed the criminal line. Newsome dragging Terry into this is nothing more than whataboutism, a rhetorical sleight of hand that dodges the actual discussion. But let's really take a pause on her main argument. She says, what is the labeling and the stereotypes? He called him a crackhead. Now, was Penny's language divisive? Yes. Crude? Absolutely. But here's a problem. Newsome is pretending that this proves racial bias, as though Penny shouting crackhead is somehow the smoking gun of systemic racism. It's not. Penny's comment was offensive, but there's zero evidence that his actions were racially motivated. No one has produced a shred of proof that race played a role in what happened on that subway. Penny intervened because witnesses reported Neely was acting aggressively, shouting that he didn't care if he lived or died, behavior that understandably alarmed other passengers. Penny didn't target Jordan Neely because of his race. He intervened because the situation was escalating and people felt threatened. Newsome knows this, but she still tries to twist single phrase into a racial indictment because it fits the narrative she wants to sell. Then there's her bizarre pivot to Daniel Penny showed no remorse. Let's be clear. Penny's demeanor after the fact has absolutely no bearing on the legal question of whether his actions were criminal. None. This is a classic emotional appeal designed to paint Penny as some callous villain who must be guilty because he didn't cry on cue for the cameras. Whether or not you like Penny personally, whether he expressed the right level of sorrow, is irrelevant to the facts of the case. A judge isn't tasked with deciding if someone is a good person. They're tasked with determining if their actions violated the law. In Penny's case, the jury looked at the evidence and said no. Newsome's fixation on Penny's lack of public remorse is little more than moral posturing, and it does nothing to change the facts of what happened. And let's talk about her final line, that Penny dishonors real service people. What exactly does that mean? Newsome wants to vilify Penny by tying his actions to his military service, as if serving in the Marine Corps somehow disqualifies you for making mistakes or misjudgments. It's a cheap rhetorical trick that tries to frame Penny as some overtrained killing machine rather than a man who found himself in an escalating dangerous situation. Newsome's attempt to pit Penny against real Marines is not only disrespectful to his service, but also to the intelligence of anyone listening.
So do you not blame Jordan Neely at all? I mean, for what he did? He deserves no blame from your perspective, right?
Did you hear the witness testimony?
I'm asking you a question.
Or are you cherry-picking the ones?
I'm asking you a question. Do you blame Jordan Neely at all for his conduct?
If Jordan Neely was a white man, we'd be saying it was an opioid crisis. He was hungry. He was mentally ill. He had a muffin in his pocket.
I wouldn't be if there were other. What about the witnesses? Let's play again, just so we're clear on the race.
Play Eddie Gibson, who begged Daniel Neely to stop.
Oh, again, but he stayed there throughout the incident.
Play the ones that fit the narrative.
But what's the narrative? There's black women who were on the subway. It was mostly people of color on the subway.
What about a white man during cross-examination who said that he was afraid of Daniel Penny, the one who poured water onto his head and said that he was afraid? He was a white man.
Yeah, okay. So,
what about the Latino man who was holding his arms?
I'm not the one identifying everyone by race. You are. You're the one who keeps telling. Why? Why do you have to? There was nothing in this case.
When you look at the FBI, when you look at when hate crimes happen, when you look at when injustice happened to black people,
but let's agree.
We don't get justice.
Newsome's argument is nothing but a tangle of race-baiting, deflection, selective outrage, and logical incoherence. Dan Abrams asks her a direct and very reasonable question. Do you blame Jordan Neely at all for his conduct? And instead of answering, Newsome pivots, ducks, and throws up a smokescreen about race. It's like watching someone try to win an argument by throwing spaghetti at a wall and hoping something sticks. First, her response, if Jordan Neely was a white man, we'd be saying it was an opioid crisis. That's not an answer. That's a dodge. Abrams asked a simple question about Neely's behavior on that subway, not about a hypothetical societal response if Neely had been white. She deflects by reframing the entire conversation as a racial issue when it didn't need to be. Let's be clear, Neely's behavior, shouting that he didn't care if he lived or died, alarmed passengers. That's a fact, not a racial construct. Whatever color, a man loudly declaring his indifference to his own life while behaving erratically on public transportation is going to make people nervous. Instead of acknowledging that Neely's actions contributed to the situation, Newsome pivots to race because she knows addressing the actual behavior undercuts her narrative. Then there's her muffin in the pocket plea. He was hungry. He was mentally ill. No one denies that Jordan Neely had struggles. He was failed by the system. But here's the thing. Acknowledging that doesn't mean we get to ignore the immediate reality of what happened on that train. It's tragic that Neely's life spiraled the way it did, but that tragedy doesn't erase the danger people felt in that moment. You can feel compassion for Neely's circumstances while still recognizing that his actions were threatening to the people around him. But Newsome doesn't want to admit that because it interferes with a carefully constructed narrative of Neely as a pure victim and Penny as a villain. Next, let's address her selective witness cherry picking. She brings up Eddie Gibson, a witness who reportedly begged Penny to stop restraining Neely, but conveniently ignores the testimony of others who said they were afraid for their safety. She even mentioned the white man who poured water on Neely and said he was scared, as if his race somehow invalidates his fear. Here's the emotional trick she's playing. She's identifying everyone by race to create a false narrative that racial bias shaped the incident, when in reality, people of all backgrounds testified to feeling threatened. Abrams calls her out on this. I'm not the one identifying everyone by race. You are. And she has no response because she knows he's right. The obsession with racial labels is her only strategy for keeping the narrative on track. And then she really takes a leap with this vague FBI comment about hate crimes and injustice against black people. Let's stop right there. What does that have to do with this case? Nothing. It's a non sequitur. Newsome throws a blanket statistic about systemic injustice to imply that Daniel Penny's actions were racially motivated, even though there's zero evidence to support that. Penny didn't target Neely because of his race. He intervened in a situation where passengers felt unsafe. The FBI hate crime data she's referencing might be valid in other discussions, but here it's a red herring. irrelevant to the facts of what happened on that train and designed solely to stir emotion. Now, the broader theme of her argument is we don't get justice. This kind of sweeping, generalized statement is designed to shut down discussion. It's the rhetorical equivalent of flipping the table when you can't win an argument. The truth is, justice was served through the legal process. This diverse jury heard all the evidence, including witness testimony from multiple perspectives of people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and reached a conclusion. Daniel Penny was not criminally responsible for Neely's death. Disagreeing with the outcome doesn't make it unjust, and it certainly doesn't make the jury racist, no matter how hard Newsome tries to say otherwise. Now, obviously, BLM weren't the only folks who were upset about the acquittal. The View had its thoughts. I think we can guess how they go.
So, there's been polarizing reaction to this verdict as well. I don't know. I don't know that seeing them celebrating in a bar made me comfortable. Yeah. You know? I mean, you killed a guy. The man is dead, and maybe you take the celebration home. You don't do it outside. But that's just me. Don't listen to anything I say. Yeah. But what and people are conflicted because he was an ill man, and the more information we're learning about him now, turns out his mom had been murdered, and that may have been what set him off on his mental path.
Yeah. Well, that's what his family is saying.
That's what they're saying. And so
he was on New York City's top 50 list of homeless people with urgent care for help.
And so, you know, there's failure all over here.
Yeah.
There's failure of the system, failure on the part of the courts, failure on the part of the hospitals, and failure on our part and how we deal with this. Because
Whoopi's commentary starts with a kernel of truth, but it quickly spirals into a muddled soup of misplaced blame and surface-level hand-wringing. First, let's address the obvious. Her comment where she says, I don't know that seeing them celebrate in a bar made me comfortable. You know, I mean, you killed a guy. Well, here's the thing, Whoopi. Daniel Penny wasn't celebrating killing someone. He was celebrating an acquittal, a verdict that said his actions were tragic but not criminal. There's a massive difference between celebrating a death and celebrating the fact that you're not going to prison for something you didn't intend to happen. Penny didn't get on that train looking to kill anyone. He stepped in to protect people in a chaotic, threatening situation. So forgive him and his defense team for exhaling after a jury agreed that he wasn't a murderer. It may not make you comfortable, but that discomfort doesn't change the facts. Now let's get to the meat of Whoopi's argument, this collective finger-wagging lecture about systemic failure. And you know what? She's partially right. The system failed Jordan Neely. The courts, the hospitals, the social safety net, all of them failed a man who clearly needed help long before he ever stepped foot on that train. Neely's life was marred by hardship and untreated mental illness. His mother's murder, his struggles with homelessness, his violent outbursts, all of it. But acknowledging that the system failed Neely doesn't mean Daniel Penny becomes a scapegoat for those failures. Penny didn't create Neely's circumstances. Penny didn't ignore Neely's repeated arrests or leave him to spiral without treatment. Penny intervened in a moment because Neely was acting erratically, declaring that he didn't care if he lived or died, a statement that terrified people on that subway train. And here's where Whoopi really goes off track, by glossing over Neely's prior history of assaults and incidents. Yes, he was on New York City's top 50 list of homeless people in urgent need of care. But let's not act like this was a man who posed no threat. Neely's behavior in public spaces had been escalating for years. He'd assaulted people, harassed commuters, and been arrested dozens of times. This doesn't mean he deserved to die. No one is saying that, but it does mean that people had every reason to be afraid when he began shouting and acting aggressively. That's not victim blaming, that's reality. What's really happening here is a moral sleight of hand. Whoopi and others want to acknowledge systemic failure while still pinning blame on Daniel Penny. They want him to represent the consequences of society's neglect. But Penny isn't the villain in this story. He's a man who stepped into a tense situation to protect strangers and tragically went too far. That's not murder, and the jury, after hearing all the evidence, agreed. And let's talk about this narrative of discomfort over Penny's celebration. The implication is that Penny should carry the full moral weight of Neely's death forever. That even though he was found not guilty, he should walk around in sackcloth and ashes for the rest of his life. But that's not how justice works. The jury's job was to determine whether Penny's actions were criminal, not whether they were tragic or regrettable. They said no. Penny has every right to feel relief and every right to move forward. Whoopi's discomfort with that doesn't make it wrong. At the end of the day, this case is a tragedy, but not every tragedy has a villain. Whoopi's instinct to blame the system is right. But then she loses the thread by moralizing about Penny. If you're angry about Neely's death, direct the anger where it belongs, at the city, the courts, and the institutions that left them to spiral. Don't put it all on Daniel Penny just because he happened to be there when the system's failure reached its breaking point.
React in the moment. Thing. How do we describe and subscribe danger and who is dangerous, right? This man got onto the train and he said...
Which one?
Penny.
The victim.
The victim. I'm sorry, Neely. A former Michael Jackson impersonator. He talked about being hungry and thirsty, and he said he didn't care if he lived or died. There is no evidence that he attacked anyone. There's no evidence that he put his hands on anyone on this occasion. No one on the train would have known that he had touched someone before. Multiple people testified that he didn't approach anyone in a threatening manner. And so when you look at that and you look at the result of what happened, my question is, where is our compassion? But as a society, where is our compassion? And one other thing is that what Whoopi said, I think, is really important. This is a child at 14 who saw whose mother was murdered by her boyfriend in his childhood home in the Bronx and then put into pieces in a suitcase. Yeah. And his family says that is when his mental health started to decline. Yeah. Where is our compassion? I agree with the compassion.
Sunny's response is wrapped in the soft language of compassion, while her argument completely sidesteps reality and twists the narrative beyond recognition. At its core, this is an emotional appeal, layered with selective framing, omission of critical context, and a heavy dose of moral finger-wagging. Sunny says, where is our compassion? And while that question is fair, here's a better one. Where is our honesty? Let's start with her attempt to downplay what actually happened on that train. Sunny says there is no evidence that he attacked anyone. There is no evidence that he put his hands on anyone on this occasion. That's a clever bit of rhetoric, emphasizing on this occasion, as if Jordan Neely's behavior in that moment existed in a vacuum. It didn't. Neely wasn't calmly sitting there with a sign that said, hungry, mentally ill, but please help. Witnesses described him shouting that he didn't care if he lived or died, escalating, acting erratically, and creating a very real sense of fear among passengers. Were his words not threatening enough? At what point does a person declaring they're indifferent to their own survival stop being seen as a danger? Sunny's portrayal of Neely as harmless requires you to ignore the context, dismiss the testimonies of scared commuters, and pretend that people should be capable of reading Neely's intentions with perfect clarity in a matter of seconds. And here's where the compassion argument starts to break down. Compassion and safety are not mutually exclusive. You can acknowledge that Neely's life was a tragic, a product of severe mental illness, systemic neglect, and a society that failed him, while also admitting that in that moment, people had every reason to feel threatened. Sunny is so focused on recasting Neely as purely a victim that she completely erases the other human beings in this story. The passengers who had no way of knowing whether Neely's erratic behavior would turn violent. Because let's be honest, this wasn't some isolated incident. Neely had a long history of violent outbursts, over 40 prior arrests, including assaults on subway riders. Was every passenger supposed to know his rap sheet? Of course not. But this history matters because it contextualizes why people felt afraid when he started shouting. This wasn't paranoia. It was a reaction to years of escalating chaos in public spaces like the New York City subway system. And then Sunny pivots to Neely's tragic backstory. His mother's murder when he was 14, his subsequent mental health issues. That's devastating, truly. But here's a problem. While it explains why Neely ended up where he did, it does not excuse the fact that his behavior put people in a position where they felt they had to act. His past doesn't erase the fear passengers experienced or the choices they made in that moment. What Sunny is doing here is emotional bait and switch, using Neely's personal tragedy to paint him purely as a victim while ignoring the immediate circumstances that led to the confrontation. It's manipulative, it tugs at your heartstrings while demanding you overlook the very real complexity of what happened. But here's the most glaring flaw in Sunny's argument. She offers compassion for Jordan Neely, but withholds it entirely from Daniel Penny. Penny, a Marine, stepped in when he believed people were in danger. Did he make a mistake? Yes. Was the result tragic? Absolutely. But acting in the heat of the moment in a chaotic situation does not make Penny a monster. Penny didn't get on that train looking to harm someone. He reacted to what he believed was a threat. Sunny says, where is our compassion, but has none for Penny? A man who now has to live with the knowledge that his actions, right or wrong, ended a life. That's not an easy burden, and it certainly isn't something to dismiss so casually. And let's not forget the broader context here. Sunny wants to discuss the homelessness crisis, mental health, and societal failure, which is good because those issues desperately need need attention. But what's frustrating is her refusal to acknowledge that this tragedy is the result of those failures, not the result of Daniel Penny. If the city of New York had addressed Neely's struggles, if the courts had intervened after he repeated arrests, if mental health systems hadn't collapsed under their own weight, Neely wouldn't have been on that train that day. Instead of blaming Penny for stepping in when the system failed, maybe direct some of that outrage at the people who allowed Neely to slip through the cracks. So here's a real question. How many more tragedies like this are we going to see before we hold the system accountable? How many more people like Jordan Neely will be left to spiral, ignored by the courts, the hospitals, and the city until it's too late? And how many people like Daniel Penny will be forced to step into chaos because no one else will? Instead of picking villains and heroes after the fact, shouldn't we be asking, why did it come to this in the first place? You tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.